So today, like I said, we're doing a study on the age of accountability. And just to kind of give some background, how long has it been? 2 months? It's been approximately 2 months, I think, since I decided I was going to do this study. And I went on Facebook and was like, hey, I'm doing this study on the age of accountability. It's going to be great. And more than usual, people chimed in and said, yeah, this is great. We're looking forward to it. And then so I sit down to do the study, and I realized I bit off way more than I could chew. I went into it thinking like, okay, because when I was a kid, teenager, the way it worked for me, and everybody has a different story on this, but the way it worked for me was, as the pastor at the church came over to my house and was doing this Bible study with my parents on baptism, because my parents hadn't been baptized. And so I was part of that, and it was like, well, James, you're old enough to know right from wrong, so that means you've hit the age of accountability. And so basically, it was like, well, if you're in a car crash tonight or something and you're not baptized, guess where you're spending eternity? Bring some cool clothing. So I got baptized, I think, the following Sunday because I didn't want to end up there. But they were defining the age of accountability as basically being able to know right from wrong. And in today's culture, like this postmodern moral relativism thing that we find ourselves in, right and wrong can vary depending on who you talk to. So if we're talking about accountability in terms of like our salvation and things tangential to that, we can't really have a sliding scale of morality dictating if we're accountable or not, what we're accountable to, what happens if we fall short, all these things. So we need some kind of a standard. So thinking about that, I decided I was going to do this study, and then I forget who it was, but somebody else had reached out to Shauna and was like, oh, I was literally just thinking, I wish somebody would do a study on this, like completely independent. So I took that as kind of confirmation, like, okay, I need to do this study. But like I said, I went into it trying to figure out, like, is there more of an objective way to look at this rather than just, does so-and-so know the difference between right and wrong? It's like, how do you judge in an objective, empirical way if somebody knows the difference between right and wrong, if we all have different standards on what right and wrong is? How do we know when that moment is? So this study, I'm just going to say right off the bat, I intended to come to a conclusion with this study. I intended to say the age of accountability is, here it is. And that didn't happen. So as we go through this, you'll see why. But first off, let's define accountability. When we talk about age of accountability, what does this mean? I spent a few weeks kind of discussing and working through this with a couple close brothers that I have that I talk with throughout the week while I'm on the truck, and just kind of bouncing stuff off of them. And my one friend was like, he has connections to Orthodox rabbis, and Messianic rabbis and things. He's in a community where there's a heavy Jewish population. And so he actually went to his rabbi friends and asked him, like, what's the age of accountability? And the rabbi was like, well, what do you mean? There's military, there's government, there's this, there's that, there's all these different. And it's like, okay, well, this is why it's so important when we talk about the age of accountability. What are we talking about? Make sure we're all on the same page. So first off, let's define accountability. Just for English, we'll get into Hebrew here in a little bit, but just for English, Merriam-Webster defines accountability as the quality or state of being accountable. That makes sense. An obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or to account for one's actions. And so I think that that's a spot-on thing. When we talk about somebody being accountable, when we talk about holding the government accountable, what are we talking about? When they do things that are wrong, when they do things that are detrimental to the population, there's some kind of recourse. There's some kind of way that we can judge and determine that they crossed a certain line, and now what do we do? So if we're talking about being accountable before Yahweh, this is kind of, in my own mind, this is what I'm thinking about. Like, if we're going to stand before Him and take responsibility for things that we've done, how does that work? How do we define what we're responsible for? Where are those boundaries? What's the target? So our first scripture reading is going to be in 2 Corinthians. We're going to read chapter 5. And as I went through this study earlier, I started to think, wow, this could be one of those things that ends up being like this massive series, because I was pulling a lot of information from from the scriptures, and I was some of it's just kind of common sense, logical stuff, but then also culturally, because we exist within a culture, we exist within a society. When we say certain things like accountability, there's a certain understood meaning when we talk to people. And so I kind of backtracked on that and decided, well, let's keep it simple, and let's just kind of address the obvious stuff and address the not so obvious stuff and then address the problematic stuff. And yes, there are some problems with this whole idea that we'll get to here in a minute. But 2 Corinthians chapter 5, if I can ever get there, we're going to read the whole chapter. For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from Elohim, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed, in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. Now he who prepared us for this very purpose is Yahweh, who gave us the Spirit as a pledge. Some translations will say a down payment or a deposit. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Master. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be home with the Master. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Messiah, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. I'm just going to pause right there. That's basically what Merriam-Webster just described as accountability. There's some kind of a standard where we're going to have to give an account for how we complied with that standard or how we violated that standard. And it says that everyone is going to have to appear before this judgment. It doesn't give a qualifier, it doesn't give an exception. And we know just common sense-wise, it's not fair if Yahweh is a just and righteous judge to let people off the hook for the things that they've done while holding other people accountable. Makes him not an impartial judge, but a partial judge. He has biases. He's not fair. And I don't serve a God like that, and I hope you don't either. Well, what am I saying? I know you guys don't. Okay, so let's continue. Let's go verse 11. Therefore, knowing the fear of the Master, we persuade men, but we are made manifest to Elohim. And I hope that if we are made manifest also in our consciences. We are not again commending ourselves to you, but are giving you an occasion to be proud of us, so that you will have an answer for those who take pride in appearance and not in heart. For if we are beside ourselves, it is for Yahweh. If we are of sound mind, it is for you. For the love of Messiah controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died. And he died for all, so that they who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. Therefore, from now on, we recognize no one according to the flesh, even though we have known Messiah according to the flesh. Yet now we know him in this way no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Messiah, he is a new creature. The old things passed away. Behold, new things have come. Now all these things are from Yahweh, who reconciled us to himself through the Messiah and gave us this ministry of reconciliation. Namely, that Yahweh was in Messiah, reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and he has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Therefore we are ambassadors for Messiah, as though Yahweh were making an appeal through us. We beg you on behalf of Messiah, be reconciled to Yahweh. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of Yahweh in him. So I wanted to open with this because there's a clear statement of accountability here, and there's a clear statement of who all is impacted by this accountability. And I didn't really have to read the whole chapter, but sometimes I just do that because I like to. I like reading Paul. I'm not one of these guys that thinks Paul should be run out of town and he's some kind of crazy bum like the trend seems to be these days, but there's a lot of wisdom here. But he's talking about this idea that, you know, what we're dealing with here in the physical is temporary. He's calling our bodies, this physical reality, a tent. And basically, this is kind of where we're at, but it's not where we're stuck at. But then he also talks about, how the judgment is a key part of how we move beyond this tent and hopefully into a nice house. My words, not his, obviously. So we know that we're judged by our deeds because we just read that. But what standard are we being judged by? It's my opinion, and I think the scriptures back this up, that we are judged according to covenant. Because just in the legal system here in America, there are certain places and certain laws where, if you commit a crime and it's obvious that you did it, when you go to sentencing, the judge will take into account, did you know the law? Were you aware of the law or were you not? Maybe you'll get a lighter sentence if you weren't aware of the law. In certain circumstances that happens. But in other certain circumstances, it's just across the board. The law is the law, period. There's no wiggle room. If you did it, you get the consequences. So let's go to Luke, and let's read chapter 12. We'll read verses 35 through 48. We're going to do Luke chapter 12, 35 through 48. Okay. Be dressed in readiness and keep your lamps lit. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master will find on the alert when he comes. Truly I say to you, that he will gird himself to serve and have them recline at the table and will come up and wait on them. Whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third and finds them so, blessed are those servants. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known of what hour the thief was coming, he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. You too be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. But yet we have thousands and thousands of YouTube videos and TikToks telling us all when to expect it, which I just find hilarious. And I used to be one of the ones that watched all those. I used to be one of the ones that my wife can vouch for the fact that I would stay up all night sometimes just poring over prophecy, trying to figure out when it was going to happen. And it's like, how much plainer does he have to be? We're not going to know until we know. Anyway, sidebar there. Okay, verse 41, Peter said, Master, are you addressing this parable to us or to everyone else as well? And the master said, Who then is the faithful and sensible steward whom his master will put in charge of his servants to give them their rations at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that servant says in his heart, My master will be gone a long time in coming, and begins to beat the servants, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. And that servant who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. So he's talking about this idea of, we tend to look at this as far as like when his coming is. Be ready for his coming. He could come at any time. People will, talk about it from this perspective. But I get down to the end, and he's talking about the servant who knows his master's will and doesn't do it is going to get many lashes. But the servant who doesn't know the master's will, even if he, because he doesn't know, he'll get a lesser punishment. So this is kind of the whole accountability thing. If he's looking between the two servants and the one servant knew his will, the other one doesn't, there's a difference in accountability. He's not holding the servant who didn't know the will to the same level of accountability as the one who did. And this is just a logical thing. We see it in our society. We treat each other this way, hopefully. You don't just have a standard that every single one applies to, and then there's no room for any kind of consideration for whether they knew or even if they were capable. So these are kind of things that when I went to find an age of accountability, ideas like this kind of muddied the water, So when we get to sin, and we know that sin, we know this from 1 John chapter 3, sin is the transgression or the violation of the Torah. Some translations will say lawlessness, anomia. And so, but when we get to sin, just on a logical point, there's different types of sin. There's obviously intentional and there's unintentional. If, like this master here that knew his servant's will and didn't do it, well, there's a couple reasons for that possibly. You could say either A, he was being rebellious and consciously chose not to do the master's will, or you could maybe say he had was absent-minded or something, or he just slipped and made a mistake, things like that. Because you can know to do something and still make a mistake. We're human. But the servant who did not know the master's will, that's kind of a different thing, because if he doesn't know what the master's will is, then he's going to violate the master's will, but there's no intention there. So when we get into the idea of looking at intentional and unintentional, if we have kids, for example, kids oftentimes, well, they do things that are wrong. I mean, I never did, but I was that one kid who was perfect and had no issues. What's that commandment about not bearing false witness? No, no. I was generally a good kid, but like any kid, I made mistakes and I transgressed. But I'll just give an example here. So, and this is absurd for a reason. If I give the keys to my car to my 7-year-old, and I say, hey, go to the store, bring me back some bread, and maybe bring back a lottery ticket, okay? And my 7-year-old says, okay, Dad, and she's going to be a good child and go help her dad. What do we think is going to happen when she gets behind that wheel and tries to run down to the grocery store to get some bread and a lottery ticket? It's probably not going to go very well. Anything that happens on that journey, if she causes an accident, or if she runs off the road and damages my car, or anything like that, when we look at the actual act that she did, and you can say, well, all these things that happened, she did. My 7-year-old ran the car into the tree. My 7-year-old caused a collision, whatever the case may be. But who is responsible for that? My 7-year-old or me? I'm obviously the one responsible for that, because my 7-year-old does not have the information, doesn't have the capability to do something like that, and I impose it on her. So these are things that have to be taken into account when we're looking at accountability. If we're going to stand before that judgment seat, if my 7-year-old goes before the judgment seat, yes, okay, you did these things, there's a cause and effect relationship, but why did this happen? It wouldn't be my 7-year-old's fault, ultimately, it would be mine. And so when I think of the age of accountability, I'm thinking it just from my own personal way that I've always viewed it, is when do we transition from that point to where I have a car accident and it's my dad's fault for telling me to do it and I wasn't ready, or I have a car accident and it's my fault. I bear the penalty. Where is that line? That's kind of a way of phrasing and kind of saying what I'm thinking about when I think of accountability in the age of. When do we make that transition from our parents being responsible for our actions before the Father because we don't have the information to be fully accountable or responsible, and then we transition into where we are standing alone before Him and we take the full weight of that upon us. So my conventional way of thinking has always been that the age of accountability is 20. To me, there's more scriptural evidence to this than there are. Like if you're looking for a hard number, if we're looking for something that is objective, where there's no sliding scale, there's no subjectivity, there's perspective doesn't have anything to do with it, then to me, there's more evidence for the number of 20. And we'll take a look at a couple of these here just real quick. Let's go to Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. And we will read verses 20 through 38. Now, the immediate context of this is the spies had just gone into the land, and they came back with their bad report. So, obviously, Yahweh's not happy with that. Verse 20. So Yahweh said, I have pardoned them according to your word. Of course, Moses had gone to intercede for the people. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of Yahweh. Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. Now the Amalekites and the Canaanites live in the valleys. Turn tomorrow and set out to the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation who are grumbling against me? I have heard the complaints of the sons of Israel, which they are making against me. Say to them, As I live, says Yahweh, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. Your corpses will fall in the wilderness, even all your numbered men, according to your complete number, from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Surely you shall not come into the land in which I swore to settle you, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. Your children, however, whom you said would become a prey, I will bring them in, and they will know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. Your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses lie in the ground, or in the wilderness. How far was I going? 38. According to the number of days which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt a year, even 40 years, and you will know my opposition. I, Yahweh, have spoken. Surely this I will do to all this evil congregation who are gathered against me. In this wilderness they shall be destroyed, and there they will die. As for the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, and who returned and made all the congregation grumble against him by bringing out a bad report concerning the land, even those men who brought out the very bad report of the land died by a plague before Yahweh. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh remained alive out of those men who went to spy out the land. Now, just as a side note here, when we look at like the whole idea of salvation, in the book of Hebrews, he likens our ultimate eternal state with like a Sabbath rest. He likens it to entering the promised land. And so we see here that out of these 600,000 plus adult men that left Egypt, only 2 actually made it into the promised land. Moses didn't even make it. 2 out of over 500,000. Now talk about a narrow gate. That's a very narrow gate. And so this should all give us kind of consideration and pause when we think about, okay, who are we dealing with? Who are we actually accountable to that he only allowed 2 people to enter the promised land? He doesn't take things lightly. And of course we see here that it was people that were counted 20 and over that were judged not worthy to come into the land. The children who were under 20 were allowed to come into the land. So if I just pause and ask a question, why? What caused Yahweh to put a line there? Why didn't he say everybody 19 and over? Why didn't he say everybody 25 and over? Why didn't he say everybody 13 and over? He chose the number 20 for a reason. Now, I don't specifically know what that is, and I don't have an answer for why he chose the number 20. It just in this specific case he did. We know that the men in 20 had been, we're not going to read the scripture here, but it talks about it. When we have the census, when all the tribes are counted, we're counting the people who are 20 and over, and with the men, we're specifically doing this so we have a tally of who we're working with. There's a count for war, basically. So the census is for people 20 and over, and then we have this whole accountability for the backsliding and the rebellion and the wilderness, the unfaithfulness. That's being reckoned to people that are 20 years and older. So there's sort of some smoke leading to a fire there, if you will. Let's go to Exodus 30. Here's another example. Exodus 30. And we will read verses 11 through 16. All right, Exodus 30, 11 through 16. Yahweh also spoke to Moses, saying, When you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, then each one of them shall give a ransom for himself to Yahweh when you number them, so that there will be no plague among you when you number them. This is what everyone who is numbered shall give. Half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs. Half a shekel as a contribution to Yahweh. Everyone who is numbered from 20 years old and over shall give the contribution to Yahweh. The rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than the half shekel, when you give the contribution to Yahweh to make atonement for yourselves. You shall take the atonement money from the sons of Israel and shall give it for the service of the tent of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the sons of Israel before Yahweh to make atonement for yourselves. So I had read over this, I don't know how many times over the course of my life, and then I did a teaching a few months ago about atonement and forgiveness, and I found this, and I read it literally, and I was like, wait a minute, we're paying money to have atonement? Because when we think of atonement, we typically tend to think of it in terms of like forgiveness of sins, in our spiritual state. And here we have a clear case of people it's all the same amount, so there's no favoritism, there's no partiality, but you're actually contributing money, and it's going towards your atonement. But it's only for people that are counted that are 20 years and older. So this kind of is a why question. Why? Why that 20? Why not 15? Why not 25? He's focusing in on this number 20 again, and he's connecting it to atonement. Because if you're under 20, you're not paying this half shekel as atonement money. But if you're 20 years and old, 20 years and up, you are. So does that imply that if you're under 20, you don't need to be atoned for, at least in the conventional way we think? Maybe. It's just something to consider. It's just another data point. So that's all the scripture that there is, that I can find anyway, that supports the age of accountability if you're going to set a hard number being 20. There's not a lot there. There's not as much as I thought there would be when I sat down to do this study. Now, some people will say the age of accountability is 13. And you hear this a lot from Judaism. My friend I mentioned earlier, he actually, when he was talking with his rabbi friends, he asked them, okay, so what is the age of accountability? And of course, they all said 13. And so he went back and was like, okay, 13. Can you give me chapter and verse? Can you give me scripture where you got the 13 number from? And he waited, and after a couple weeks, they got back to him with no scripture. Because there is no scripture, even they see it, that supports 13. They were pointing back to tradition. They were pointing back to the writings of the rabbis. And the rabbis reckoned, of course, we know the term bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, whether it's a boy or a girl, this coming of age thing. The idea is that in Judaism, when you turn 13, you have become an adult. You become a man, you become a woman. And it's crazy to get my mind around, but there are some historical accounts of way back in the day, people actually getting married and starting families around that age because they were considered adults. But there's nothing scriptural that supports this. The closest thing that people can maybe get is when you get in the Gospels, and Yahshua's 12 years old, his parents have taken him down to the temple for the Feast of Passover, and he stays behind. And it says he was 12, and of course they come back, and he's like, didn't you know I'd be about my Father's business? Well, some logic can say, okay, he was able to take that stance because he was now considered an adult. If he was still considered a child, he wouldn't be able to voluntarily leave his parents like that, and he certainly wouldn't get away with it. There would be some accountability, but when you read the text, they just kind of give him a stern talking to, and then they go home, and that's it. So it doesn't really seem like he transgressed anything as far as a boundary there that we would say, he is accountable for this or that. So, but that's the closest thing that I can find that would imply around that age of 12 or 13 for somebody being accountable for their actions. So that's all there is in the text. Believe it or not, that's all there is in the text that I could find that even remotely points to here is when somebody is accountable for their actions if we're looking for an age. From there, we get into gray areas. We get into logical kind of things. And by the time we get through discussing these kinds of things, I do think that with the number 20 being there like it is, I can't ignore that as a data point. So my overall conclusion is that, yes, that number 20 is something that we hone in on, but we have to also factor in all the other variables. So let's go to 2 Chronicles. We're going to read one of these. 2 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. 2 Chronicles 36. We're just going to read one verse here. This is towards the end of Judah's time in the land before they were taken out by Babylon. 2 Chronicles 36, and let's read verse 9. Oh, helps if I'm in the right chapter. Okay. Jehoiakim was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of Yahweh. Now, another brother of mine brought this up, and I read it, and I was like, wait a minute. I was rocking and rolling, I was on a good path on this study, and then you just had to throw this wrench into gears. We have an 8-year-old who's made king, and he was only king for a short time, and it says he did evil in the sight of Yahweh. That's the same language that Yahweh uses to describe all the other bad kings. So if I didn't know his age, I see a hand up. Mine says 8. Yeah. Yeah, Josiah was young too. I'm reading about Jehoiakim in 2 Chronicles 36, chapter 36, verse 9. And I'm reading from the New American Standard, which is based on the Masoretic Hebrew. Some say 18. ESV says 18. That's interesting. Interesting.
I have Blue Letter and I have both King James and NIV beside each other.
Uh-huh.
King James says 8, NIV says 18.
Well, that's interesting. There's another wrench in the gears. This just keeps getting better. Either way, though, they're under 20. But
There's a footnote here. One Hebrew manuscript and some Septuagint manuscripts in Syria say 18.
okay.
Most Hebrew manuscripts say 8.
Okay. That's interesting. So which one do we go with? That one says he's 18. Okay. Maybe that's where they got the 18 from, whether they were trying to be consistent with the text. Interesting. Okay.
And just to keep that interesting, I just looked it up. Thank you, Reverend. And both the King James and NIV there's 18.
Wow, okay. I might have to get some more translations. I've been doing the New American Standard forever and just never saw that. So we've got two possibilities here for Joachim's age, either 8 or 18. If he's 18, he's under 20. If he's 8, he's under 20. But just for the sake of hypothetical argument, let's say that the 8 is right. Having an 8-year-old be called evil, that he did evil in the sight of Yahweh. And of course, Josiah was mentioned. He became king when he was 8. I know for a fact they all say he was 8. And he's reckoned as a good king. But either way, if you have an 8-year-old that is, this kind of goes back to the whole car thing. Let's assume that he was 8 years old and he did evil in the sight of Yahweh. A kid can do bad things. A kid can do things that are wrong. If we look at somebody this young, they would have had counselors surrounding them. They would have had some kind of network. They would have had elders and mentors and things like that. We see this really pronounced when we get into the story of Rehoboam. He was surrounding himself. He had all these counselors left over from his father that were giving him good counsel on what he should do with the people, but he let all of his young friends, all of his posse come around and give him bad counsel, which ultimately blew up in his face. But whether he's 8 or whether he's 18, he's listed as a king who did evil in the sight of Yahweh, right along with all the other kings that we know were, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, however old they were, however long they reigned. And so this is a question mark for me. It's a question that I don't have an answer for. Is Yahweh just saying he did evil things? Or is he saying that he is, not only did he do the evil things, but he's also listed as an evil king because I'm holding him accountable for the evil things he did? Like an 18-year-old, I can get my brain more around the idea just from, being around 18-year-olds, being an 18-year-old myself. An 18-year-old is going to have the potential to understand right and wrong far more than an 8-year-old does. They've got 10 years of life experience. They've got 10 more years of counsel. If they've got access to the scriptures, they've got 10 more years of having that access. So just apples to apples, an 18-year-old should be more accountable for what they do than an 8-year-old. But when I saw the 8-year-old here, I was like, wait a minute. So is Yahweh holding him accountable? Because if Yahweh is going to hold an 8-year-old king accountable for the evil he did, well, you're just blowing right past that number 20. That number 20 means nothing. And we're kind of right back in the place where we started, where we're trying to figure out who's accountable. Are we looking at their maturity? Are we looking at their knowledge? Are we looking at their wisdom? How are we as human beings able to comprehend and grasp who is accountable and when? I mean, obviously the Father can see everything. He knows our hearts. He knows our minds. He can make that judgment call. But when we are thinking about it in our own terms, how do we do it? So that was kind of a gray area. And even if he's 18, that's still under 20. So he still was not given the opportunity to get past 20 before he was called an evil king. And then here's some logical questions. I have a friend who had a career in law enforcement. And when I brought up the number 20 and suggested that maybe it's a hard number, he said, "No, wait a minute. In law enforcement, he had several cases where people knew that you were tried as an adult when you turned 18. So if you commit a crime when you're a minor, the sentencing is different than if you're an adult. And so people would intentionally, knowing that, take advantage of that and commit crimes because they knew that they would either get away with it or they'd have a lighter sentence. Get all your bad behavior in now before you're accountable. It's like Mardi Gras. You spend that week just getting all that bad behavior out of your system before Lent comes on, that people do. And it's that same idea. Like the moment you put a hard number on it, people are going to be tempted to walk right up to that number and not pass it. If the number is 20, and we say, okay, the moment you turn 20, you're fully accountable for all your sins before Yahweh, that implies that before you're 20, you're not accountable for any of your sins before Yahweh. So if a 17-year-old goes out and robs a bank, is Yahweh going to judge him for that? If a 17-year-old goes out and murders, is Yahweh going to judge him for that because he's not 20 yet? These are these kind of gray, murky areas. And so if you set that number at 20, it has the potential for people to take advantage of it, is my point. And that, in my mind, is problematic. So what about maturity? I mentioned this earlier. I've got 4 kids. They range from 7 all the way up to 16. Now, on paper, the 16-year-old is going to be more mature than his younger siblings, and that's going to be a sliding scale based on age. Obviously, the more older you get, the more mature you should get. But we know that in reality, everybody matures at a different rate. You can put 20 17-year-olds in a room, and you'll have varying degrees of maturity. You'll have people in that room who are wise, like adults. It's like they were born old or something. And then you'll have people in that room who are just complete buffoons who have no idea of any kind of decorum or anything and just act like heathen. You're going to have people like that in that room because maturity is not specifically dependent on age. It's dependent on environment. It's dependent on circumstances. It's dependent on your education, your upbringing, who you surround yourself with, all of these variables. So we get back to this whole idea that if we take away the number, we're back to this sliding scale where it's kind of every man for himself. Everyone's doing kind of what's right in their own eyes. It's like, well, my kid is more mature than your kid. No, my kid's more mature than your kid. Said, well, what if our kids are both knuckleheads? I mean, that's possible too because parents can have bias, right? Anyway, my point with all this is that if we're looking for the scriptures to tell us when the age of accountability is, I just don't think there's enough information there. I thought there was going into this, but after looking at it for literally weeks at this point, I can't say that in every single case that that the moment you hit 20, you're on the hook. And this isn't even factoring in people who are not in the covenant. I'm only talking about people who have actually committed to entering into covenant with Yahweh, and actually agreeing to the terms, signing on the dotted line, so to speak. I'm not even talking about John Q. Public out there who has no interest in following Yahweh or people of other faiths, anything like that. I'm not even processing what their accountability is like, because that gets really murky. Are they held to the same number of 20 as Israel appears to be? I don't know. They obviously have a completely different set of cultural norms, a completely different set of scriptures than we do, so I don't know how he looks at them. We'll read one more scripture. Let's go to Ezekiel 45. This ended up being a lot shorter than I intended, just because if I just ponder on these logical things, you just kind of end up spinning your wheels, and there's not enough material to actually pinpoint, an actual finite time frame. Ezekiel 45, let's read verse 18 through 20. Now, this is Ezekiel's temple, and in the context here, he's describing all the sacrifices and offerings that are going to be made when this temple is erected. Ezekiel 45, 18 through 20. Thus says Yahweh Elohim, in the first month, on the first of the month, you shall take a young bull without blemish and cleanse the sanctuary. The priest shall take some of the blood from the sin offering and put it on the doorposts of the house, on the four corners of the ledge of the altar, and on the post of the gate of the inner court. Thus you shall do on the seventh day of the month for everyone who goes astray or is naive. So you shall make atonement for the house. Now, my translation says naive there. Some might say simple. I don't know what other words would be used in the English, but this is basically a way to imply someone who is ignorant, not because of like just their behavior or whatever. Like in modern terms, we would say this is maybe somebody who is slow, maybe somebody who's mentally handicapped, maybe somebody who has some kind of an environmental issue where maybe they didn't develop. Who knows? This is somebody who is not capable of understanding and processing the way a quote-unquote normal person would, okay? And these people have a special sacrifice that is done for them in Ezekiel's temple, and it's connected to atonement. So that's a whole other thing here. If you're over 20 and you are not mentally up with everybody else, does he hold you to the same standard of accountability that he would everybody else? Well, you're over 20. Or, like with this sacrifice here, does he make allowances for the fact that you are not mentally capable of processing and doing things the way everybody else does, even though you are maybe technically over the age of accountability? And again, that's one of the things here where, Yahweh has the eagle-eye view. He can see the whole big picture. We don't. And kind of the conclusion that I came to with this is I see enough information here to point towards the number 20. I don't see any information for the number 13 if we're looking for a number. I do see information for 20. But what I don't see information on is what about that person that's 19 and a half? Are they allowed to get away with things just because they're 19 and a half and they're not 20 yet? And it's one thing if a person is doing things in ignorance because they don't know or they, accidental or whatever. It's another thing if a person abuses that thing and says, I'm 19 and a half, I'm not accountable for what I'm doing, therefore I'm just going to do it and I'll be absolved of it. So you've got the potential things with that. You've got the whole maturity thing that varies from child to child as they go. I mean, there are children who are probably more mature than I am. I don't know what that says about me, but it's probably true. There's probably at least one kid somewhere in the world somewhere who is more mature than me on some level. And, you see these child prodigies and things that have this crazy intellect. Is that maturity? Or is there some other way to judge their maturity besides their intellect, besides their knowledge, these kinds of things? And so I don't have an answer. So in my own mind, where I kind of came to the conclusion, if I accept that the number is 20, and I just say, okay, equal weights and measures, if Yahweh chooses a number to make it a level playing field, or as level as it can be, because he doesn't show partiality, he doesn't play favorites, he chooses a number, and that's the number when you're transitioning into adulthood. Of course, in America, you're legally an adult when you're 18, but yet there's certain things they make you wait until you're 21 to do. 20 is just kind of in that ballpark. So if he sets that number, if I'm a parent and I have children, there's a couple things I can do. Knowing that eventually they're going to hit that number 20, and let's assume that that is the age of accountability if there is one, what I can do is I can train them and I can teach them and I can interact with them as if they are accountable now. Because the more mature kids will be able to handle that, and you can get a head start because they're headed towards 20 anyway. Like, why wait until they turn 20 and then all of a sudden say, okay, you've hit the age of accountability, and now let's start teaching you what to do with that. Now let's start teaching you the covenant. Let's start teaching you how to love your neighbor as yourself, how to love Elohim, how to please him, how to keep the commandments. If you treat your kid like they're accountable now, functionally, on a practical level, and if we start training them and acting as if they're accountable, whether they are or they're not, their behavior is going to be, better than it would be otherwise. Their walk is going to be better than it would be otherwise. Whether they're accountable or not, they're still benefiting from it. And then by the time they do hit 20, and if they do, come under the accountability at that point, then they're ready to go. They're in a good spot. They're in a good position. We as parents have done a good job of putting them there. But at the same time, if we just wait until they're 20, just because, whatever reasons, I think that we put them at a handicap. So in any case, that's kind of where I'm at. And as I'm saying it, it feels very anticlimactic because, like I said, going into this, I had hoped to be able to have here's chapter and verse, here's the whole thing laid out. And after weeks of drilling through this, I just could not find that. So there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of gray area in this. And I do think that, if like I said earlier, from the people that have hit 20 and maybe aren't quite there yet for whatever reason, it makes logical sense to me that Yahweh would give them some allowances, because it's not just in my own human mind. If somebody is mentally handicapped and they're 30 and they're not able to process the same things, a sharp 20-year-old could, should they be held to the same standard of accountability as that younger person who has all their mental faculties? To me, it would be a more just thing to do to give that person a little bit more grace, a little bit more leeway. So is there an age of accountability? Yes. Can I tell you what it is for sure? No. But I can tell you that I think we're best off if we treat it like it's 20 and then also simultaneously treat it like it's now. Because we're preparing our kids for whenever, because Yahweh's seeing things through different eyes than us. Whatever he's seeing, if he's looking at my 17-year-old son, he's knowing in his own mind, he knows when he's going to be looking at him and start to judge him for his sin. And so, but I don't necessarily have that information. But if I train him, then he gets to a point to where he's being judged by Yahweh and he's in a good spot. And he's a good kid, so I'm not worried about him. But anyway, so I'll close it at that. Hopefully that wasn't too big of a letdown. I know that, like I said, people were pretty excited when I talked about doing this, so it must have tapped into something. I wonder if people had been thinking about this or something. But at this point, I'll open the floor for questions, comments, strong opinions.